Hello everyone, this is Nathan Rourke from the Family Defense Network with another lesson on shelter. Today we're going to be getting into lean-to shelters. Now as you know, lean-tos are half-face shelters that offer ample airflow most of the time through them. So they're not tight and they don't create a dead airspace like your debris hut does. But where they do shine is when you want to make a shelter big enough for multiple people. When you have a situation where you need shelter perhaps from the wind and the rain, but it's not going to get really, really cold. Or if you're really planning on using a large amount of fire and radiant heat from fire as a part of your shelter plan. That's where your lean-tos are really going to come into play. So today we're going to be setting up a lean-to shelter here in the forest. We are going to be using a couple of tools that I commonly carry with me. One of them is a simple emergency blanket. Now this isn't the super thin, paper thin Mylar emergency blanket. This is a double-sided emergency blanket that has grommets in the corners. It's still a relatively lightweight piece of equipment to carry. It's very versatile. It's something you can wrap up in. It's waterproof, but I like it because it also brings the added flexibility of creating a shelter with it. So creating a roof with this and a reflective wall with this to trap heat from your fire. So we're going to be employing this today as part of our setup. But as we do this, I want you to keep in mind that with lean-tos, you could make it out of all natural materials like we did our debris hut. I just want you to imagine creating a half-face debris hut. So we would have a horizontal ridge pole with ribs coming off of it covered in leaves. And that's going to create your half-face lean-to using nothing but what the forest has to provide. So think about all the lessons, combine them, use your knowledge, and you'll be able to work with the flexibility that the situation might ask for in any given survival situation. So we're going to get started here, but the first thing that we're going to look at is where do you want to lay down? All right, so again, I'm picking a spot that has good drainage. I'm picking a spot that has good wind protection. I'm picking a spot that has good solar gain. I'm picking a spot with good materials because we are going to start with a leaf bed. We're still going to be using leaves for our bed in this situation. But I also want to pick a spot with ample firewood and with material to build a reflective wall for my fire. So we are a little close to a creek here in this situation, but I chose to be close to a creek so that we could gather rocks from that creek to build our reflective wall with. So it's all about kind of picking and choosing what you need, where your resources are, what sacrifices you're going to make. I stated in an earlier shelter video that if you get real close to creeks, the air does tend to be a little cooler down by creeks, but I think in this situation, we're going to build up our fire in such a way that we're going to kind of cancel out the cool air of the creek. The other thing that you always want to consider when you're building a lean-to roof, especially one out of impervious materials like this emergency blanket, is when water runs off of your roof, where is it going? A lot of times I've seen students build a lean-to or a shed roof construction shelter, but they've built it in a way that when the water runs off of their roof in a big rainstorm, it then continues to run directly right under their shelter. So remember, you're creating a pretty big water displacement system when you put this roof up. So you want that water to hit your shelter roof, run off your shelter roof, hit the earth, and continue running away from your shelter. So always consider that. There's all kinds of great uses here. We can use this as a water catchment system too if we're going to build a roof like this and we need to collect survival water. Another lesson, another time. But always consider where your water is running coming off of the roof. All right, so we're going to get started with a leaf bed, and then we're going to come back and construct the lean-to and the fire reflective wall, and we're going to build ourselves a little shelter to sleep in tonight. Okay, y'all, so we've created our leaf bed just like I taught you before. Have a structure of logs. We've been laying leaves in, laying down on the leaves to compress them, laying more leaves in, laying down on them to compress them. Now I feel like we have a pretty solid 4 to 6 inches of leaf bed underneath us. So we're just going to time to employ our cover or our over shelter, so to speak. And like I mentioned, we're going to be using this this emergency blanket. There's several of them out there on the market. Several different companies make a product very similar to this, but it's not huge. It's about 5 by 7. But it's big enough to cover one person. So tonight we're going to be making a one-person lean-to with this type of material. This could be a large sheet of plastic. It could be anything that's impervious to rain. All right, so the main objective of this, there's three. One is to keep rain off your head, two is to keep wind off your back, and then three is to trap the heat of your fire. So you need a material that's going to do those things for you. Now let me mention a couple things. When you are going to be tying up a tarp, you need to think about the structure around you to which to tie. So I did pick this area because of the trees that are around here. I have options to tie this tarp up. I am going to be having a high side going down to a low side. That's therefore our lean-to. The other thing is I felt the wind before I started building this situation, and what you ideally want is a rather consistent crosswind to your lean-to. Because if I put a fire out here and I have the heat coming into me, this crosswind is going to draw the smoke away from me. And hopefully, if everything goes well, then I'm going to have a lot of heat from the fire without trapping smoke in my sleeping area. But large prevailing winds are going to be coming again from the northwest. So I want to, if I can, put the back of my lean-to the northwest, or at least to the north, which is how it's going to be situated here this evening. So at least if big gale winds come in, this material is going to help break that wind off of me and keep that convective heat loss from running away from me, keeping me warmer and of course drier. So our next step is going to be to set up this tarp. I'll be using a couple knots, which I'll teach you in a later video, but I'll be using a couple half hitches and probably a taut line hitch as well. But I'll be tying up to these trees and then running the back end down to some stakes. A couple things you're going to want to know though is don't allow the rear of your tarp, if you can help it, don't allow it to touch the ground. You want a tiny air gap, now, number one, for ventilation, so you don't get a lot of condensation in your shelter. But number two, it's a stop gap from water. As water runs off of your shelter, it drips off of the tarp and away from you. If you let the shelter touch the ground all the way, you tend to collect mud puddles on the tail side of your shelter, which then adds to a wetter environment, a colder environment, a more uncomfortable environment. So let me get this set up and then we'll check back in and see what it looks like. So I have the tarp set up. It took me a couple minutes, but using half hitches and taut line hitches and a few pieces of small cord I had in my pocket, I was able to get this lean-to shed roof set up over my leaf bed. Notice the height, okay? I don't want my front side to be really tall, because again, the taller it is, the less heat it traps, the more heat is allowed to escape out the top. I want a good steep angle though, so that water is shedding positively away from me. I also want a steep enough angle so that it actually can catch the heat of my fire as we employ the fire here in a minute. All right? So all of these things have to come into play, as well as adequate coverage from rainfall. So as I lay in my leaf bed, am I going to be protected from rainfall? Again, I noticed the way that the weather patterns come from this area, which is coming from this way. So harsh weather's most likely going to come in from this way. The shed roof's going to help protect me from that wind, from that rain, while at the same time gathering heat from my fire. So our next step is going to be to build our fire and our fire pit. And so what you're going to notice is we don't want our fire to be directly underneath our lean-to. For obvious reasons, we'll melt our shelter, destroy our shelter, and take away our cover and our wind block. So the general rule of thumb is a good step away from your leaf bed is where you want to put your fire, okay? That way you still have ample radiant heat to catch coming off of your fire, but your heat also has plenty of room to dissipate into the atmosphere, the heat that's not being caught, so that it's not in danger of melting your shelter, burning your shelter, catching your leaf bed on fire. And you have that wind channel that I mentioned earlier, where the breeze coming down the valley here, following the creek, can take the smoke and move the smoke away from me so that I don't wind up in a big smoke bath sleeping all night long. Now, a couple quick notes. Again, I mentioned if the weather wasn't going to be really cold. Tonight is probably going to be a little chilly, down in the 30s. I may choose to put end caps on my lean-to, so to make it a three-sided shelter. And I could do that with brush and leaves. So again, making a framework out of sticks, banking up leaves on either side. It's going to make a more three-sided reflective heat trap. It's also going to keep the wind from blowing through this way and taking my heat away. So this is the lean-to in its most basic form, but please know that you could build end caps using brush, using other equipment you may have. If you have ponchos or backpacks or whatever, block the wind from coming in either end and just leave one face open for your fire heat to gather up. On the back side, I did exactly what I told you. I left about 1 inch to 2 inches of gap between the edge of my tarp and the earth. That way I can get a little bit of airflow coming through to wick moisture away. I also have a nice break in contact so that water is positively dripping off my tarp and draining away from my shelter. So all these things are going to come into play. Our next step is going to be to build our fire pit. Now, in this type of strategy of shelter, your fire pit is going to be really important because we do need to build a reflective wall. Now, this wall is going to be on the far side of our fire, and its whole purpose is to bounce the heat, the radiant heat of the fire, back at me in the shelter. And so if you can imagine a reflective wall, and then a fire, and then me, the fire's heat gets bounced into my shelter, gets trapped by my tarp here, and so I essentially am sitting in a little bit of an oven. And that's essentially what we're trying to make here, is a small oven. So the rock wall is going to bounce the heat towards me, it's going to get trapped by my tarp, and I'm going to be nicely warmed all night long in my oven. So our next step is to build this reflective wall. So let's get busy and I'll check back in once that's built. Darkness is falling, we need to move fast, but we got a reflective wall built here. I used an old log as a backstop to lean these rocks up against. If I had a little bit more time, I might try to dig them in, stand them straight up and down, and really work on getting as high of a vertical surface as I can, or almost vertical surface as I can. The higher my reflective wall, the more heat it's going to trap and push back at me. This is certainly going to help tonight, what I have here. And so just using stones from the creek and around the creek, we were able to get these in. The bigger, the flatter stones, the taller the stones, the better the reflective wall. This might be one of those projects like a debris hut where this will get me through the night tonight. Tomorrow I might find some better stones and build it up even higher and nicer to give me a little bit more reflective heat. So our next step now is to build a fire. Now, one advantage of having a big, long reflective wall like this rather than a small kind of basketball size fire pit is that we can burn long sticks throughout the night. So our fuel can be 4 to 5 feet long, which helps it burn for longer times. It also helps me as far as gathering materials. I don't have to break them down. I can feed big logs through the fire through the night. So our next step is going to be to get this fire going. We're going to gather up some wood and get it going so you all can see the whole thing in action. So again, heat reflects off the wall back into the lean-to shelter. I'm sleeping on the leaf bed to prevent that conductive heat loss. We have good convective wind break here. We have radiant heat gain, and if it rains, I feel quite confident that I'm going to stay pretty darn dry. So I've really addressed all those basic principles that we talked about from our beginning lessons in shelter building. So let's hurry up, we'll get this fire going, and we'll check back in. All right, folks, we got a fire going here up against our reflective wall. I'm on the leaf bed inside the lean-to, and I'm baking in here. It's really quite hot right now. But as dusk continues to fall and as I get settled in for the evening, I'm going to keep feeding this fire, building a good solid bed of coals, and then I'm going to have a good stash of firewood to get me through the night. It's important when you're using fire and you're planning on it to last through the night that you really get some good hardwoods in your firewood supply if you're able to do so. Hardwoods are going to last longer, they're going to burn longer with a more consistent heat through the evening. So your oaks and your locusts, you know, those are some of the key ones around here that I would be going for. Maybe birches if that's all I had. Beech isn't a bad one. But anyway, hardwoods is the key. You want those coals, you want that long, drawn out, consistent heat. And the plan here is using the heat of the fire, I can curl up in my leaf bed and I have a radiant heat source all night long. If I wake up and I'm a little chilly, I just restock the fire and then fall back asleep again. And so normally when I sleep like this, it is a bit of wake up, stock the fire, fall back asleep. I might wake up half a dozen times through the night to restock the fire, and then things get real toasty real fast again and I fall back asleep. And then when the fire dies down and I get a little chilly, that chilliness will wake me up, I restock the fire. So of course the reflective wall is making that fire much more efficient, as is this tarp catching the heat. I mean, right here where my hand is, that's super warm right now. This nice reflective coating on the tarp is bouncing that heat right down to me. I got a good wind block here. I like the firewood to be where I can grab it without moving too much. So I can just kind of, you know, cozy up in my leaf bed and be able to reach out and grab some firewood and feed it into the fire. And notice how I am using longer pieces of firewood, because in the end, this fire is going to be 4 to 5 feet long. I want it reflecting heat on my whole body. And so I'm going to use longer firewood to do that. Now you can imagine if we had a multi-person lean-to, all right, if we had a larger tarp or made a larger debris hut lean-to or one out of sticks and leaves, we would have even a longer fire. And that fire would be heating our home all night long, and everyone would have little firewood piles by them. So when they wake up in the night, if they're a little chilly, they put on some firewood. Now, most often when I'm sleeping with multi-people in a lean-to, I don't elongate myself to the fire like this. It just doesn't work. Then you might have a lean-to that's 20 feet long. That doesn't happen. So we make our lean-to deeper, and most of the time we put our feet to the fire and our heads away from the fire, because your feet are what get cold first, and then you wake up, feed the fire, and carry on with your night. So with multi-people, this is the lean-tos shines. When you have a lot of people, you need to stay warm, keep warm through the night using fire like this. So y'all, using these concepts that you learned in this series on shelter, you can pretty much think outside the box and make shelters that can get you through a lot of different situations. But think about all of those dynamics of heat loss or heat transfer that I taught you about. And if you address them, then you stay alive. You maintain that crucial 98.6. All right, so get out there, practice making your lean-tos, practice making your reflective walls, figure out different materials you can make reflective walls out of. It just doesn't have to be stone. You can build a reflective wall out of logs. All right, logs and mud makes a pretty good reflective wall. Sheets of tin foil make a reflective wall. If you're in an urban setting, sheets of roofing material, anything that can bounce heat off and put it back at you. I'm gonna throw one more thing out at you as far as natural shelter. Imagine if my tarp was a rock overhang. All right, so now I have a completely natural shelter using a rock overhang and a reflective wall, and putting myself in a double reflective surface. I really start baking myself as an oven, and that really works wonderfully. It's one of my favorite natural shelters, are rock overhangs or shallow caves, coupled with a leaf bed and a reflective wall. All right, y'all, I hope you enjoyed this lesson on shelter, and get out there and practice. Take care.